Who is God? What is God? Is there a God? And what does God do? These 4 questions are commonly found in theology. You might be asking, what is theology? In order to get a true understanding of what it is and what we're dealing with, you can start at the term itself. The term theology is derived from the Latin 𝓕𝓸𝓵𝓵𝓸𝓀, which means study of or understanding of God or gods. And this can be derived from 2 words found in the term itself. First is the Greek theos, which means God, and logos, which means reason. So basically, anytime you see something with ology, you know you're dealing with the study of or understanding of something. Now, when we're talking about theology and the study of God, we must also include the idea that we're also studying God's character and God's actions in relation to the cosmos, especially God's relationship to humanity, because we're not only looking at God himself, but everything God has to do. Now, when we say that it's the study of God, this can be seen as quite intimidating because it almost feels like there's no end to answering questions and the amount of questions that can arrive. And for this reason, scholars today now divide theology into 4 different strands. There's biblical theology, historical theology, systematic or dogmatic theology, and practical theology. Biblical theology is one of the most easiest to understand when you look at the name itself. In a way, what it's really asking is, what does the Bible have to say about God? What does God do? How does God act? It's a common Christian understanding of theology, of what the Christian background is on God. Historical theology is basically just a continuation from biblical theology. So instead of looking strictly at the scripture and what happened during those times itself, it's actually moving onward. And it's undertaken within the practices of faith, paying special attention to all the movements of human history from the perspective of biblically informed views of space and time, and accounts for the dynamic movements of dogmatic theology and the practices of the church. So we have to always understand that we're changing human beings, and when we look at the historical theology, we're basically comparing the very scripture itself and how those thoughts and ideas have changed over time in the past. And then this leads us on to systematic theology. Just like historical was a branch from scriptural, the same thing with systematic. But instead, it's trying to appropriate the theological voices of history. How can we use this history and actually understand it in our times today? And that leads us to practical theology. It begins with the full consciousness that all the practices of the church and Christians are underwritten by theologies, whether biblical, historical, or systematic. The goal of practical theology is to reflect intentionally on present practices and their ingredient theologies. So we're actually looking at how we have developed through the systematic theology, reflecting on the historical, and basically assessing, are we actually making these events, these historical events, current to us in the proper way? Are we actually making sense of it critically and correctly? So there you have it, the 4 different ways of looking at theology. Special thanks to the Grace Theological Seminary with their article, What are the 4 Types of Theology? Answers from a Theology School.